Often in my videos here on YouTube, I share with you my camera settings so you can take better photos of your digital camera. But sometimes I wonder if that's enough. Understanding the reasoning behind why I chose those particular settings, I think can be a real help. And that's what I want to try and do in this video. I'm going to take you behind the image. Welcome to the PhotoGenius channel. Hi, Paul here from PhotoGenius. Welcome to my channel where I share regular photography tutorials, all designed to help you get more from your digital camera. If you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Now this video is called Behind the Image, and I'm going to take a look at two images. One is going to be a portrait image and the second is an image of the sun setting over Brisbane. Now as usual, I want to share with you my camera settings, but possibly more importantly, I want to talk about the reasoning behind why I use those particular settings, because my goal with this video, as with this channel, is to help you get more from your camera so you can take better photos. And I'd really love to know if you like the format of this video and if you would like to see more behind the image videos in the future. And you can do that by giving the video a thumbs up or leaving a comment down below. So I want to begin by showing you this portrait image that I shot of a gentleman called John. Now he had travelled over 150 kilometres to do a one-to-one photography session with myself here in Brisbane. So I took this image of John towards the end of our session. We'd had a great time walking around Brisbane, taking photos, talking about camera settings, and it had started to rain. So what I decided is we'd head into this bar, sit down, stay dry, and just wrap things up. And whilst we were sitting there, I commented to John about how good the quality of light was coming through this window, and would he mind if I took his portrait. And I took this with my Fujifilm X100S, and here are the camera settings. So let's now break down the process step by step that I went through to take this image. Now please note that the images I'm featuring in this video were shot using the camera's manual mode, because that gives me control over the camera's shutter, the aperture, and also the ISO. Now composition is incredibly important and can make or break an image, so I think that's where you should start. If you don't, and you do your focusing and balance your exposure only to then decide on a different composition, there's a good chance you're going to have to refocus and maybe balance your exposure again. So you're working twice as hard. So in my book, composition rules, that's your starting point. This composition follows the rule of thirds, with my subject off center and to the right of the frame. Now this creates what is often referred to as negative space to the left of the subject. So with my composition done, the next thing I want to do is make sure my subject is in focus. So the focus mode that I had my camera set to was the AFS, or autofocus single mode. Now if you've got a Canon camera, this is called one shot. It's exactly the same, just a different name. And this is the ideal focus mode for shooting subjects that aren't going to move. When taking portraits, it's really important to ensure the eyes of the subject are in focus. So my next step was to move the focus point to the eye. If your subject is looking directly into the camera, then focus on either eye. But if the subject is looking off camera, then focus on the eye that is closest to the camera. The focus is so sharp with this image that if we zoom in, you can actually see tiny drops of rain on the subject's glasses. Okay, so composition is done, my subject is in focus. The next thing I'm thinking about is exposure, which is all about light. Now, a good place to begin when you're taking portrait photos, I think, is aperture. And that's because aperture affects not just light, but also depth of field. Now, if this is something you're less familiar with, I have made a separate video all about it. You'll find a link in the description below this video. I'll also pop one up here. But for now, all you really need to know is depth of field affects how much of your image is acceptably sharp in front or behind of the point of focus, or in other words, backgrounds and foregrounds. Take a look at these two images. Both have a very shallow depth of field. Now this means the background is out of focus. So to achieve a similar look, I'm setting the aperture to f2.8, which is wide open. So with my aperture set, the next thing I'm thinking about is my shutter speed. Now, for this image, I actually chose to use a fairly slow shutter speed. And there's two reasons behind this. Number one is that my subject isn't moving, so there's no pressure or need to use a really fast shutter speed. Reason number two, if you recall, this was shot on a fairly overcast day, it had been raining, so the light levels were fairly low. Well, by choosing a slower shutter speed, that means the shutter is open longer, and that gives the camera more opportunity to record light. Using a standard lens, I usually don't go lower than 60th of a second if using the camera handheld, but on this occasion I'm choosing 30th of a second, feeling confident with my hand holding abilities. Okay, so I've set my aperture, I've set my shutter speed. There is one more thing I can adjust if I want to that will affect exposure, and this of course is ISO. Now on this occasion I didn't need to, and here's why. ISO 200 is my usual default setting. Now after I'd set my aperture and shutter speed, I looked at the camera's light meter and everything was balanced, which meant that I didn't need to make any further changes. But had the light meter not been balanced, then I could have changed the ISO. Let me show you. So here we can see an exposure value of -1 or -1 stop. Now to fix this, I could slow the shutter down to 1/15th of a second, but that's a little bit too slow. So instead, by increasing the ISO from 200 to 400, which is an increase of 1 stop, the meter is now balanced. So just to recap, this is my usual workflow when taking a portrait image. Number one, always composition. Remember composition rules. I can't stress that one enough. Number two, focusing. You want to make sure your subject's in focus. Remember earlier I shared a tip about focusing on the eyes. Incredibly important. And finally, balancing exposure. Usually thinking about my aperture first because of depth of field, then the shutter speed, and then occasionally maybe tweaking the ISO. Now let's take a look at this image which I took a couple of years ago. The sun setting over Brisbane, the traffic moving along the freeway. It's a shot I really like, and of course I had to approach it in a completely different way to the previous image. Once again I'm thinking about composition first, and this image was a bit tricky because I had to maneuver and squeeze the camera through a very small space between some railings. So with the camera turned on its side, which we usually refer to as portrait mode, my composition was done. The next step was to focus. Now I chose to use the AFS autofocus single focus mode, which if you've got a Canon camera is one shot, because once again that's the perfect focus mode for non-moving subjects. And if you look at the image, which is pretty much an urban landscape image, with the exception of the traffic on the road, everything else is static and non-moving. With my Nikon camera turned on its side, the next step of course is deciding where to focus, and I chose to go for the road signs above the freeway. Okay, let's talk about exposure. Now with the portrait photo that I talked about a few moments ago, I started by thinking about my aperture and then I moved on from there. But with this image, I was thinking about my shutter speed first for two reasons: light and movement. Now with this picture, my goal was to capture those really cool light trails as the vehicles go up and down the freeway. So I knew that I would want the shutter to be open a little bit longer than normal. This is called a slower shutter speed, or slowing the shutter speed down. Now the other thing that I was up against was the light. Of course, the sun was going down, it was getting darker. So once again, I knew that my shutter would need to be slower, because the longer the shutter's open, the more light the camera can record. Now, I did do a few different test shots and I tried a few different shutter speeds, eventually finding that a shutter speed of 1.6 seconds, in my opinion, gave me the best results. So with the shutter speed locked in at 1.6 seconds, the next thing I needed to think about was my aperture. Now, unlike with the portrait image where I went for a lower f number, which is a wider aperture because I wanted a soft blurry background, with this type of image, of course, I want the image to be sharp pretty much through from foreground to the midground to the background. So you make the aperture smaller. This is a bigger f number. So I wanted to use something in the kind of f11 to f16 range because that gives us a greater depth of field. Eventually I settled on f11. Now, once I locked in my shutter and aperture, I checked the camera's light meter, which was showing a very slight underexposure. So I increased the ISO from 200 to 250. And then I was done and I was ready to take the shot. Now, if you want to try this for yourself, make sure you're using a tripod. Also, I suggest turning off any camera or lens stabilization, and if possible, use a remote or the camera's built-in self-timer to help minimize unwanted camera movement. If you would like to see more behind the image videos where I break down all my camera settings but also explain to you the thinking behind why I use those camera settings, let me know in the comment section down below. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up because it does help the videos get noticed. That in turn helps the channel grow. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. All that's left to do is for me to say thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.